The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as hundreds of tourists gathered for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Children pressed their faces against the iron railings while parents fumbled with cameras. Everyone hoping to catch the perfect shot of Britain's most famous soldiers. Standing perfectly still in his red tunic and towering black bearskin hat was Sergeant Tommy Richardson, though none of the tourists knew his name. To them, he was simply another piece of living history, as motionless as the stone lions that guarded the palace gates. But Tommy was far more than a tourist attraction god at 29 years old. Tommy had already lived through more than most people twice his age. His journey to this prestigious post had been anything but ordinary. Growing up in a small mining town in Yorkshire, he had watched his father struggle to find work after the local pit closed down. Money was always tight in the Richardson household, and Tommy learned early that if he wanted something in life, he would have to fight for it. School had never been his strong suit. While other kids seemed to breeze through their lessons, Tommy found himself struggling with reading and math. His teachers often wrote him off as another troublemaker from the wrong side of town. But Tommy had something that couldn't be taught. In any classroom, an iron will and a determination that refused to bend when he turned 18. Tommy made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. Instead of following his mates to the local factory or signing up for unemployment benefits, he walked into the Army recruitment office and signed his name on the dotted line. His mother cried that day, not from sadness, but from pride. She knew. Her son was choosing a path that would make something of himself. The Army transformed Tommy in ways he never expected. The discipline that his teachers had found so lacking suddenly flourished under military structure. He discovered he was a natural leader, someone others looked to when things got tough. His physical training scores were always among the highest in his unit, and his shooting accuracy was legendary, but it was during his first deployment to Afghanistan that Tommy truly proved his worth. The memory still played in his mind sometimes, especially during the quiet moments of his guard duty. His patrol had been ambushed in a narrow valley, pinned down by enemy fire with nowhere to run. While other soldiers took cover, Tommy had made a split-second decision that saved 4 lives that day under heavy fire. He had crawled across 50 meters of open ground to reach a wounded comrade who was bleeding out in no man's land. The bullets were so close he could feel the heat as they whizzed past his helmet, but Tommy never wavered. He dragged his fellow soldier to safety, then went back for another. And then another dot by the time the firefight was over. Tommy had pulled 3 wounded men to safety and single-handedly held off an enemy advance that could have overrun their position. His commanding officer later said it was the bravest thing he had witnessed in 20 years of military service, the medal they gave him for that day was nice. But what mattered more to Tommy was knowing that 3 families back home still had their sons because of what he did. That knowledge gave him a quiet confidence that no amount of training could instill. After 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq, Tommy had earned the respect of everyone who served with him. When the opportunity came to join the Queen's Guard, his superiors didn't hesitate to recommend him. It was considered one of the highest honors in the British Army, reserved for only the most exceptional soldiers. The training for ceremonial duties was unlike anything Tommy had experienced in combat. Standing perfectly still for hours at a time while tourists poked, prodded, and tried every trick in the book to make him move. It required a different kind of mental toughness than dodging bullets or navigating enemy territory. But Tommy had found his calling. There was something deeply satisfying about representing his country in this way, being a living symbol of British military tradition. Every morning when he put on his uniform, he thought about all the soldiers who had worn it before him. Stretching back through centuries of history, the tourists saw only the surface, the bright red tunic, the shiny buttons, the impressive bearskin hat that added nearly a foot to his already considerable height. They didn't see the hours of training, the physical conditioning, or the combat experience that qualified him to stand at this post. Most visitors were respectful, content to take their photos from a distance and marvel at the pageantry. Children would sometimes wave shyly, and Tommy would catch their eyes for just a fraction of a second, giving them a memory they would treasure forever. Elderly veterans would occasionally nod with understanding, recognizing a fellow soldier beneath the ceremonial dress, but there were always a few who saw the guards as nothing more than entertainment, human statues put there for their amusement. They would make faces, tell jokes, or try increasingly elaborate schemes to provoke a reaction. Tommy had seen it all during his 3 years on ceremonial duty. He had learned to tune out the noise, to find a quiet place in his mind where he could remain perfectly still while chaos swirled around him. It was a skill that served him well, both in combat and in his current role. The ability to remain calm under pressure, to think clearly when others lost their heads, had saved lives in Afghanistan and maintained dignity at Buckingham Palace. As the afternoon wore on, Tommy noticed the usual mix of tourists beginning to gather. A group of Japanese visitors moved efficiently from spot to spot, their cameras clicking constantly. A family from America struggled to keep their young children from running off in different directions. An elderly couple from Germany read quietly from a guidebook, pointing out architectural details to each other. The changing of the guard ceremony wouldn't begin for another hour, but already the crowd was building. Tommy had performed this routine hundreds of times, but he never took it lightly. Each ceremony was a chance to honor his uniform, his regiment, and his country. What Tommy didn't know was that this particular afternoon would be different from all the others. Somewhere in the growing crowd, trouble was brewing. 6 young men had spent the better part of the day drinking at a nearby pub, celebrating the end of their university exams. They were looking for excitement, for something to make their night memorable. As Tommy stood at his post, maintaining the perfect posture that had become second nature to him, he had no idea that his years of combat training were about to be put to the test once again. But this time, the enemy wouldn't be armed insurgents in a foreign land. This time, the threat would come from his own countrymen, and the battlefield would be the very steps of Buckingham Palace. The stage was set for a confrontation that would remind everyone watching that beneath the ceremonial uniform stood not just a symbol, but a soldier. The sound of loud laughter echoed down the street long before anyone could see where it was coming from. 6 university students stumbled around the corner, their voices carrying over the usual traffic noise of central London. They moved in that unmistakable way of people who had been drinking for hours, too loud, too confident, and completely unaware of how they appeared to everyone else. Leading the group was a tall, lanky young man with messy brown hair and a cocky grin that seemed permanently stuck to his face. His name was Danny, and at 22, he had already earned a reputation among his classmates as someone who never backed down from a dare or missed an opportunity to be the center of attention. His expensive designer jacket and perfectly styled hair suggested he came from money, the kind of background where consequences rarely seemed to stick. Danny had grown up in a wealthy suburb, where his father owned a successful law firm and his mother spent her days organizing charity events for other bored housewives. He had never wanted for anything in his life, never had to work for pocket money, and never really understood what it meant to face real hardship. University had been just another playground for him, funded by his parents' seemingly endless bank account. Behind Danny walked his 5 friends, each trying to keep up with his energy while nursing their own alcohol-fueled confidence. There was Pete, a stocky redhead who had been Danny's roommate since their first year. Pete usually served as Danny's right-hand man in whatever scheme they cooked up next. He wasn't the brightest of the bunch, but he was loyal and always ready to follow Danny's lead, no matter how stupid the idea might be. Next to Pete walked Connor, thin and nervous-looking, constantly pushing his glasses up his nose. Connor came from a middle-class family and had worked part-time jobs throughout university to help pay for his education. He often felt out of place among his wealthier friends, but desperately wanted to fit in with their crowd. Today, the alcohol had given him a confidence he rarely felt when sober. The other 3, Ryan, Jake, and Oliver, were typical university lads who had bonded over late-night gaming sessions and shared complaints about their professors. They weren't bad kids, really. Just young men who had never learned when to say no to a friend's bad idea. Each had spent the afternoon matching Danny drink for drink, trying to prove they could keep up with his pace. Their celebration had started innocently enough. After finishing their last exam of the semester, they had decided to hit the town and blow off some steam. What began as a casual lunch had turned into an all-afternoon drinking session that moved from one pub to another. By the time they stumbled out of their fourth establishment, the sun was beginning to set, and their judgment had long since departed. The group had been wandering the streets of London for the past hour, looking for something exciting to do. Danny had suggested they check out some of the tourist attractions, claiming he wanted to show his friends parts of the city they had never seen. But really, he was just looking for an audience for whatever performance he had brewing in his alcohol-soaked brain. "Come on, lads," Danny shouted, throwing his arms wide as they approached Buckingham Palace. "Let's go see what all the fuss is about with these toy soldiers everyone talks about." His friends laughed and cheered, caught up in his infectious enthusiasm. None of them stopped to think about what they were actually planning to do or whether it was a good idea. The alcohol had washed away their common sense, leaving behind only the desire to impress each other and avoid being seen as the boring one in the group. As they got closer to the palace gates, the crowd of tourists became thicker. Families with children moved slowly along the sidewalks. Elderly couples sat on benches reading guidebooks, and groups of foreign visitors posed for photos against the backdrop of one of Britain's most famous landmarks. Danny's group cut through the crowd with the careless confidence of young men who believed the world owed them space. They bumped into people without apologizing, talked loudly over other conversations, and generally made nuisances of themselves wherever they went. "Look at all these tourists," Pete laughed, gesturing at the families around them. "Don't they have anything better to do than stare at some old building?" "Probably never seen anything this fancy back home," Ryan added, his words slightly slurred. "Wait till they get a load of what we're about to do." Connor felt a small knot of worry forming in his stomach, but he pushed it aside. He didn't want to be the one to ruin everyone's fun, especially when Danny was in such a good mood. These were the moments when he felt most accepted by the group, and he wasn't about to throw that away over some vague sense of unease. As they approached the actual palace grounds, Danny's eyes lit up like a child who had just spotted the biggest toy in the store. There, standing in perfect formation, were the Queen's Guards in their iconic red uniforms and towering black hats. "There they are," Danny announced as if he had discovered something nobody else had noticed. "The famous tin soldiers that everyone makes such a big deal about." The group gathered around him, following his gaze to where Tommy Richardson stood at his post. From their distance, they couldn't see the weathered face beneath the bearskin hat or the steady eyes that had seen combat in some of the world's most dangerous places. All they saw was what appeared to be a man playing dress-up for the entertainment of tourists. "I bet they're not even real soldiers," Jake said, squinting at Tommy through his beer-induced haze. "Probably just actors they hire to stand there and look pretty." "Only one way to find out," Danny grinned, that mischievous look spreading across his face that his friends had learned to both love and fear. "Let's go have a closer look." Oliver, who had been relatively quiet throughout the afternoon, finally spoke up. "Maybe we should just take some photos and head back. It's getting late, and I promised my girlfriend I'd call her tonight." Danny turned to look at him with the kind of expression he reserved for people who dared to question his ideas. "Come on, Oliver. Don't be such a bore. We're just going to have a bit of fun. What's the worst that could happen?" It was a question that none of them bothered to answer seriously. In their alcohol-fogged minds, the worst that could happen was maybe getting told off by a security guard or having to move along. None of them considered that they were about to confront a trained soldier who had survived multiple combat deployments and earned his position through years of distinguished service. As they made their way through the crowd toward Tommy's position, their laughter grew louder and their gestures more exaggerated. Other tourists began to step aside, sensing that trouble was brewing but unsure exactly what form it would take. Danny walked with the swagger of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions, his friends trailing behind him like eager disciples. In his mind, He was about to provide entertainment for everyone watching and prove once again that he was the most daring member of their group. What Danny didn't realize was that he was walking into a confrontation with someone who had faced down armed enemies in foreign lands and emerged victorious. Tommy Richardson might look like a ceremonial figure standing motionless in his fancy uniform, but beneath that red tunic beat the heart of a warrior who had never backed down from a fight in his life. The stage was set for a collision between privilege and duty, between youthful arrogance and hard-earned respect. And everyone watching was about to learn that some lines should never be crossed, no matter how much liquid courage you might have in your system. Danny and his friends pushed through the crowd of tourists until they were standing just a few feet away from Tommy Richardson. The royal guard remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his breathing so controlled it was barely visible. To the casual observer, he looked like a wax figure that had been placed there for decoration. "Look at this guy," Danny said loudly, making sure his voice carried to the tourists around them. "He's like a robot or something. I bet he doesn't even blink." The other tourists began to step back slightly, sensing that something uncomfortable was about to happen. Parents pulled their children closer, and elderly visitors exchanged worried glances. But Danny was too focused on his performance to notice the changing mood of the crowd. "Watch this," Danny announced, moving closer to Tommy until he was standing directly in front of him. He started making exaggerated facial expressions, pulling silly faces and waving his hands in front of the guard's face. "Hello? Anyone home in there?" Tommy's training kicked in automatically. Years of ceremonial duty had taught him to expect this kind of behavior from tourists. Most people were respectful, but there were always a few who saw the guards as entertainment rather than soldiers. He had learned to tune out the noise, to find a calm place in his mind where nothing could disturb his focus, but something felt different about this group. There was an edge to their behavior that went beyond typical tourist curiosity. The alcohol on their breath was obvious, and their body language suggested they were looking for trouble rather than just having innocent fun. "I don't think he's real," Pete said, joining Danny in front of Tommy. "Maybe it's just a really good statue. They probably switch them out every few hours." Connor, still feeling nervous but not wanting to be left out, stepped forward and tentatively reached toward Tommy's rifle. "Can we touch it? I mean, if he's not going to move anyway?" The moment Connor's fingers made contact with the weapon, Tommy felt every muscle in his body tense. His military training screamed at him that someone was trying to take his weapon, but his ceremonial duties demanded that he remain motionless. It was a conflict that created an almost unbearable tension in his mind. "Don't touch his gun, you idiot," Oliver whispered, finally showing some sense. "That's probably not allowed." But Danny wasn't about to let anyone spoil his fun. "Oh, come on, what's he going to do about it? File a complaint?" He laughed at his own joke and moved even closer to Tommy, now standing so close that the guard could feel his breath on his face. The situation was escalating faster than anyone expected. What had started as juvenile pranks was turning into something more serious. Danny's confidence was growing with each passing second that Tommy failed to react, and his friends were feeding off his energy. "I bet I can make him move," Danny declared, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "No one can stand perfectly still if you know which buttons to push." Ryan, who had been hanging back with Jake, suddenly found his voice. "Maybe we should just take some photos and go. This is getting a bit weird." But Danny wasn't listening to anyone except the voice in his head that was telling him to push harder, go further, prove his point. The alcohol had stripped away whatever social filters he might have normally possessed, leaving behind only his worst impulses. "Look, he's not even sweating," Danny observed, reaching out to touch Tommy's face. "It's like he's not even human." The moment Danny's hand made contact with his cheek, Tommy felt something snap inside him. Every instinct he had developed over years of combat training was screaming at him to react, to defend himself, to neutralize the threat. But he forced himself to remain still, drawing on reserves of self-control that few people possessed. The crowd around them was growing larger, as word spread that something interesting was happening. People were pulling out their phones, some recording video, others snapping photos. What had started as a private moment of stupidity was turning into a public spectacle. "This is mental," Jake whispered to Oliver. "He's like a machine." "Nothing we do affects him at all." Danny heard this as a challenge rather than a reason to stop. In his alcohol-clouded judgment, Tommy's lack of reaction wasn't professionalism or discipline, it was weakness. He had never encountered anyone who couldn't be provoked into some kind of response, and he wasn't about to accept defeat now. "Let's see how still he stays when we really test him," Danny announced, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone. "Pete, grab his arm. Connor, you take the other side. We're going to see if we can actually move this statue." The other tourists were now openly staring, some looking shocked, others appearing genuinely worried about what they were witnessing. A few people had started backing away, sensing that the situation was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Tommy could feel the circle of young men closing around him, their intentions becoming clearer by the second. This was no longer harmless tourist behavior. This was a coordinated assault on a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. Every fiber of his being wanted to react, to show these privileged kids what happened when you cornered a trained soldier, but his duty was to maintain the dignity of his position, to represent centuries of military tradition, to honor the uniform he wore. So he remained perfectly still, even as his heart rate began to increase and his muscles prepared for action. "Come on, guys," Connor said, his voice shaking slightly. "Maybe we've had enough fun for one day. People are starting to stare." "Let them stare," Danny shot back. "That's the whole point. We're giving them a show they'll never forget." Pete was now standing on Tommy's left side, while Connor positioned himself on the right. Ryan and Jake flanked them, creating a wall of bodies around the guard. Oliver hung back, clearly uncomfortable but unable to bring himself to walk away from his friends. "On three," Danny said, his hands reaching toward Tommy's shoulders. "One. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other tourists had stopped what they were doing to watch the unfolding drama. Some were recording everything on their phones, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. Tommy's breathing remained steady, but inside his mind he was making calculations. 6 attackers, all intoxicated, all younger and less experienced than him. If this escalated to physical contact, real physical contact, not just the foolish grabbing they had been doing, he would have to choose between his ceremonial duties and his survival instincts. Years of combat experience had taught him to read situations, to anticipate when words were about to turn into actions, and everything about this moment told him that these young men were about to cross a line that would change everything for all of them. The crowd held its breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen. In the space of the next few seconds, 6 university students were about to learn that some people should never be underestimated, no matter how harmless they might appear on the surface. 3. Danny shouted, and suddenly everything changed. The 6 young men moved as one, their hands reaching out to grab different parts of Tommy's uniform and equipment. What had been childish pranks just moments before instantly became something much more serious. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was an assault on a serving member of the British military. Danny's hands shot toward Tommy's shoulders, trying to physically shake him from his position. Pete grabbed at his left arm, while Connor went for the right. Ryan reached for Tommy's ceremonial rifle, his alcohol-clouded judgment telling him it would be funny to see if he could pull it away. Jake made a grab for the tall bearskin hat, thinking he could knock it off Tommy's head. Even Oliver, despite his earlier hesitations, found himself reaching toward the guard's belt, caught up in the moment and not wanting to be the only one. Not participating, for the tourists watching, time seemed to slow down. What they had been witnessing as an uncomfortable but relatively harmless incident suddenly became something that made their stomachs drop. The playful atmosphere vanished in an instant, replaced by a tension so thick you could almost touch it. Tommy felt the first hands make contact with his uniform and something inside him shifted. All the training, all the discipline, all the years of maintaining perfect composure under pressure It all led to this moment. He was no longer just a ceremonial guard being harassed by drunk tourists. He was a soldier under attack, and every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to defend himself, but still he remained motionless for a few crucial seconds. His training as a Queen's Guard demanded that he try every possible option before abandoning his post or breaking his composure. These weren't enemy combatants in a war zone, they were British citizens. However misguided their actions might be, the problem was that the 6 young men had no idea what they were dealing with. In their minds, they were just having a laugh with what they saw as a living statue. They had no understanding that Tommy had survived firefights in Afghanistan, that he had earned his position through years of exemplary service, or that beneath his ceremonial uniform was a man trained in combat techniques that could disable multiple attackers in seconds. "Come on," Danny laughed, trying to rock Tommy back and forth. "Give us some kind of reaction." "Anything." Pete was pulling on Tommy's left arm now, trying to make him take a step to the side. "It's like he's bolted to the ground or something." Connor, emboldened by his friend's actions, tightened his grip on Tommy's right arm. The nervous young man, who had been hesitant just minutes before, was now fully committed to the group's assault. His judgment completely compromised by alcohol and peer pressure. The tourists around them were no longer just watching, they were backing away, many of them looking genuinely frightened by what they were seeing. Some were still recording with their phones, but their expressions had changed from curiosity to concern. A few people had started looking around for security guards or police officers. "This isn't right," an elderly woman whispered to her husband. Someone should stop them, but no one knew quite what to do. The situation had escalated so quickly that most people were still trying to process what they were witnessing. The line between harmless tourist behavior and something much more serious had been crossed so suddenly that many observers were caught off guard. Tommy could feel hands all over his uniform now, grabbing at his equipment, his clothing, his ceremonial sword. Ryan was actually trying to lift his rifle, pulling on it with both hands. The weapon was secured to Tommy's uniform, but Ryan's attempts to remove it were becoming increasingly aggressive. Jake had managed to grab the bottom of Tommy's bearskin hat and was trying to pull it off his head. The hat was also secured, but Jake's tugging was causing it to shift, threatening to obstruct Tommy's vision. If that happened, he would be fighting blind. Oliver, swept up in the moment despite his earlier reservations, had grabbed Tommy's ceremonial belt and was trying to unbuckle it. In his drunken state, he thought it would be hilarious to see the guards' equipment fall to the ground. The coordinated nature of their attack was what made it so dangerous. Tommy could have handled one or even 2 drunk tourists easily while maintaining his composure. But 6 people grabbing at him simultaneously, trying to take his weapons and equipment, pulling at his uniform, this was beyond anything his ceremonial training had prepared him for. Inside his mind, Tommy was making rapid calculations. His ceremonial duties required him to maintain his position and composure at almost any cost. But his military training was telling him that he was under assault by multiple attackers who were trying to take his weapons. The conflict between these 2 sets of instructions was creating an almost unbearable tension. The crowd around them was growing larger as more tourists realized something significant was happening. People were pointing and staring, some looking shocked, others appearing worried. The atmosphere had shifted completely from the peaceful, tourist-friendly environment that had existed just minutes before. "I think we should stop," Connor said suddenly, a moment of clarity breaking through his alcohol-induced haze. "This feels wrong," but Danny wasn't listening. If anything, Tommy's continued lack of response was making him more aggressive. In his twisted logic, the guard's professionalism was a challenge that needed to be overcome. "No way," Danny replied, his grip on Tommy's shoulders tightening. "We're not stopping until we get some kind of reaction. I don't care if we have to pick him up and carry him around." That was the moment when everything changed. Danny's threat to physically move Tommy from his post crossed the final line. A Queen's Guard abandoning his position wasn't just a personal failure, it was a breakdown of centuries of military tradition and discipline. Tommy felt something snap inside him. Not anger, exactly, but a cold, calculated decision that the time for patience had ended. These 6 young men had moved beyond harassment and into assault. They were trying to take his weapons, remove his equipment, and force him from his post. In any other context, such actions would be met with immediate and overwhelming force. The tourists watching could sense that something was about to change, even if they couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. There was a shift in Tommy's posture, so subtle that most people missed it, but those paying close attention could see that the perfectly still statue was preparing to move. Ryan gave another hard yank on Tommy's rifle, this time managing to shift it slightly in its securing straps. Jake succeeded in loosening the bearskin hat enough that it tilted forward over Tommy's eyes. Oliver was working at the belt buckle with determined persistence. Pete and Connor were pulling on his arms with increasing force, trying to make him take a step, and Danny, drunk on alcohol and his own sense of power, made the fatal mistake of reaching for Tommy's ceremonial sword. The moment Danny's hand touched the hilt of that sword, every alarm bell in Tommy's military-trained mind started ringing at once. Someone was trying to take his weapon. Multiple attackers were attempting to disarm him and force him from his position. This was no longer a matter of ceremonial duty. This was a combat situation. Tommy's years of training in Afghanistan, his survival instincts honed by multiple deployments, his expertise in hand-to-hand combat, all of it came rushing back in an instant. The patient, disciplined ceremonial guard was about to give way to the combat veteran who had never lost a fight in his life. The moment Danny's fingers wrapped around the hilt of Tommy's ceremonial sword, everything changed. It was like a switch had been flipped in Tommy's mind, transforming him from a patient ceremonial guard into the combat-tested soldier he truly was. Years of military discipline had taught him exactly when the line between tolerance and action had been crossed, and that line had just been obliterated. For one final second, Tommy remained perfectly still, giving his attackers one last chance to realize their mistake and back away. But they were too drunk, too caught up in their own arrogance, too convinced that they were just having harmless fun with a human statue to understand the danger they had placed themselves in. Danny pulled harder on the sword, grinning widely, as he felt it shift slightly in its ceremonial mounting. "Look, guys, I think I can actually get this thing loose." That was the moment Tommy Richardson stopped being a ceremonial guard and became a soldier, defending himself against multiple attackers. The transformation was so sudden and complete that the tourists watching barely understood what they were seeing at first. 1 second, Tommy was a motionless figure being manhandled by 6 drunk young men. The next second, he was moving with a speed and precision that seemed almost impossible for someone who had been standing perfectly still just moments before. Tommy's first move was to secure his weapon. His right hand shot down to clamp over Danny's hand on the sword hilt, his grip like a steel trap closing. Danny's confident grin vanished instantly as he realized he couldn't pull his hand free. Tommy's fingers, strengthened by years of military training and combat experience, held him in place with crushing force. "What the hell?" Danny gasped, suddenly understanding that the situation had changed completely, but Tommy wasn't finished. While maintaining his grip on Danny's hand to keep him from taking the sword, he used his left elbow to strike Pete in the solar plexus. It was a controlled, precise blow, hard enough to disable but not hard enough to cause permanent injury. Pete doubled over immediately, the air rushing out of his lungs in a painful whoosh. The crowd of tourists gasped as they watched the perfectly still guard suddenly spring into action. Many of them had been recording the harassment, but now they found themselves documenting something entirely different. A trained soldier, defending himself against assault. Connor, who had been pulling on Tommy's right arm, suddenly found himself facing the full attention of a combat veteran. Tommy twisted his body, using Connor's own grip against him to throw him off balance. The young man stumbled backward, his glasses flying off his face as he crashed into Ryan, who had been trying to wrestle the rifle away. Both Connor and Ryan went down in a tangle of arms and legs, their earlier confidence completely shattered. What had seemed like a game just seconds before had become something terrifying and real. Jake, who had been tugging on Tommy's bearskin hat, suddenly realized that the guard's eyes were now focused directly on him. There was something in that stare that made his blood run cold, the look of someone who had faced real danger and emerged victorious. Jake's hands released the hat immediately, but it was too late to avoid consequences. Tommy's free hand shot out and grabbed Jake by the front of his shirt, lifting him slightly off the ground with surprising strength. "You want to touch my uniform?" Tommy spoke for the first time since the assault began, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone nearby take a step back. "Let me show you what happens when you assault a Queen's Guard." With a controlled motion, Tommy set Jake down hard on his backside, not injuring him but making it clear that he was completely outmatched. Jake scrambled backward on his hands, his earlier bravado completely gone. The entire sequence had taken less than 10 seconds, but already 4 of the 6 attackers were either down or backing away. Oliver, who had been working on Tommy's belt, stood frozen in shock, his hand still extended toward the guard's equipment but no longer moving. "I suggest you step away," Tommy said to Oliver, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Now, Oliver didn't need to be told twice. He stumbled backward so quickly that he nearly tripped over his own feet, his face pale with shock at how completely the situation had changed, that left only Danny still trapped by Tommy's iron grip on his hand. The young man who had started all of this was now face to face with the consequences of his actions, and the cocky confidence that had carried him this far was crumbling fast. "Let me go," Danny demanded, trying to pull his hand free from the sword hilt. But Tommy's grip was unbreakable, and every movement Danny made only seemed to make the hold tighter. "You wanted a reaction?" Tommy said quietly, his face just inches from Danny's. "Congratulations, you got one?" The crowd of tourists was now completely silent, watching the confrontation with a mixture of fascination and fear. Many of them were still recording, but the mood had shifted from entertainment to something much more serious. They were witnessing the moment when youthful arrogance met military discipline, and it was clear which one was going to win. Danny's friends were slowly picking themselves up from the ground, nursing bruised ribs and wounded pride. Pete was still struggling to catch his breath, his face red from the precise strike to his midsection. Connor was crawling around on his hands and knees, searching for his glasses while Ryan tried to help him up. Jake remained on the ground where Tommy had placed him, unwilling to risk drawing the guard's attention again. "This is crazy!" Connor wheezed, finally locating his glasses and putting them back on with shaking hands. "He can't do this to us. We're just tourists." "No," Tommy replied, still maintaining his grip on Danny while keeping his eyes on the rest of the group. "You stopped being tourists the moment you decided to assault a serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces and attempt to take my weapons." The words hit the 6 young men like a bucket of cold water. For the first time since their drinking session had begun hours earlier, they were starting to understand the severity of what they had done. This wasn't just a prank that had gone too far. They had committed actual crimes. Against a soldier in the service of the Crown, other tourists in the area had begun to notice the commotion and were gathering at a respectful distance. Some were taking photos, others were whispering among themselves about what they had witnessed. A few people had pulled out their phones to call the police, recognizing that this was beyond the scope of normal tourist behavior. Tommy could see security personnel approaching from the distance, drawn by the crowd and the obvious disturbance. He knew that within minutes the situation would be handed over to the proper authorities. But for now, he had 6 young men who needed to understand exactly how close they had come to making the biggest mistake of their lives. "You have no idea how lucky you are," Tommy told Danny, his voice quiet but carrying clearly to everyone watching. "In Afghanistan, people who tried to take my weapons didn't get the chance to walk away from it." Danny's face had gone completely white. The reality of what he had attempted was finally sinking in, and he was beginning to understand that he had picked a fight with someone completely out of his league. The transformation in Tommy was remarkable to witness. Just minutes before, he had been the picture of ceremonial discipline, standing motionless, despite increasingly aggressive harassment. Now he stood with the confident posture of someone who had complete control of the situation, his years of combat experience evident in every movement and word. Within 30 seconds of Tommy's first movement, the entire situation had been completely reversed. What had started as 6 drunk university students bullying what they thought was a helpless ceremonial guard had turned into a masterclass in controlled combat techniques. The 6 attackers now found themselves scattered across the pavement. Nursing their bruises and their wounded pride, Tommy still held Danny's hand firmly against the sword hilt, his grip unbreakable despite the young man's increasingly desperate attempts to pull free. Danny's face had gone from cocky confidence to genuine fear as he realized he was completely at the mercy of someone whose capabilities he had drastically underestimated. "Please," Danny gasped, his voice shaking, "just let me go." "We didn't mean anything by it, we were just having a laugh." Tommy's expression remained unchanged, his military training evident in the way he maintained complete control over both his emotions and the situation. "A laugh?" he repeated quietly. "You call assaulting a soldier and attempting to take his weapons having a laugh?" The crowd of tourists had grown larger as word spread through the area that something significant was happening. People were pointing and whispering, many of them recording everything on their phones. The atmosphere was tense, with everyone sensing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Pete was still on the ground, doubled over and struggling to catch his breath from Tommy's precise strike to his midsection. The blow had been perfectly calculated, hard enough to disable him completely, but not so hard as to cause lasting damage. It was the kind of technique that came from years of training in how to neutralize threats without unnecessary violence. Connor had finally found his glasses and put them back on, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep them straight. On his face, the young man who had been so eager to impress his friends just minutes before was now sitting on the pavement, staring up at Tommy with a mixture of fear and awe. "I can't breathe properly," Pete wheezed, one hand pressed against his chest. "What did you do to me?" "Pressure point strike to the solar plexus," Tommy replied matter-of-factly, his attention still focused primarily on Danny. "It will pass in a few minutes. You're lucky I showed restraint." Ryan was trying to help Connor to his feet, but both young men were moving slowly, clearly shaken by how quickly their group's assault had been turned against them. The rifle that Ryan had been trying to wrestle away from Tommy remained securely in place, its owner having defended it with the skill of someone who had protected far more important things in far more dangerous situations. Jake remained exactly where Tommy had placed him, sitting on the ground and making no attempt to get up. The young man's eyes were wide with shock, and he kept glancing between Tommy and his scattered friends as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Oliver stood a few feet away, his earlier enthusiasm for the group's prank completely gone. He kept taking small steps backward, clearly wanting to distance himself from the situation, but unwilling to abandon his friends entirely. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as the reality of their actions began to sink in. "We're university students," Connor said weakly, as if this fact might somehow excuse their behavior. "We were just celebrating finishing our exams. We didn't know... Didn't know what?" Tommy asked, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone listening pay attention. "Didn't know that assaulting a member of the military is a serious crime? Didn't know that attempting to take a soldier's weapons could be considered an act of terrorism under current law?" The word terrorism hit the 6 young men like a physical blow. Danny's struggles to free his hand became even more frantic, while his friends exchanged horrified glances. In their alcohol-fugged minds, they had been playing a harmless prank. The idea that their actions could be classified as terrorism had never occurred to them. "Terrorism?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "But we're not terrorists. We're just students." "Terrorism isn't defined by who you are," Tommy explained, his years of military experience evident in his understanding of the law. "It's defined by your actions. When you coordinate an attack on a military target with the intention of taking weapons and forcing a soldier from his post, that meets the legal definition regardless of your motivations." The crowd around them was growing larger and more restless. Some tourists were backing away, sensing that the situation was beyond their understanding. Others pressed closer, fascinated by the dramatic reversal they had witnessed. The flash of camera phones was constant now, capturing every moment for social media and news outlets. In the distance, Tommy could see palace security guards approaching at a brisk pace. Behind them, he spotted the distinctive uniforms of Metropolitan Police officers, their presence indicating that someone in the crowd had already called for backup. The situation was about to be handed over to the proper authorities. "Security's coming," Oliver said, pointing toward the approaching guards. "Maybe we should just run." "I wouldn't recommend that," Tommy said calmly, still maintaining his grip on Danny's hand. Running from the scene of an assault on a military installation would only add more charges to what you're already facing. Danny's face had gone completely white as the full implications of their actions began to sink in. Charges? What kind? Oh, charges. Tommy's expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was almost enjoying watching these privileged young men face the consequences of their actions for perhaps the first time in their lives. Assault on a member of the armed forces, attempted theft of military equipment, public disorder, and depending on how the Crown Prosecution Service decides to handle it, possibly charges related to threatening national security, Tommy listed. Off matter-of-factly, each of those carries significant penalties. Pete had finally managed to sit up, though he was still breathing heavily and holding his midsection. "This is insane," he gasped. "We were just drunk kids messing around. They can't seriously prosecute us for that." "Actually, they can, and they will," Tommy replied. "The law doesn't provide exceptions for being drunk or young when you assault military personnel. If anything, the current security climate means they're likely to prosecute to the full extent of the law." At the palace security, guards had reached the edge of the crowd and were pushing through toward the confrontation. Tommy could see their professional assessment of the situation, the way they took in the scattered attackers and his own controlled stance. These were experienced security personnel who had dealt with incidents like this before, though probably not many involving 6 simultaneous attackers. Connor was now crying quietly, the full weight of what they had done finally hitting him. "My parents are going to kill me," he whispered. "I'm supposed to start my internship next month. They'll never hire me with a criminal record." "You should have thought of that before you decided to assault a Queen's Guard," Tommy said, though his tone had softened slightly. Despite everything they had done, he could see that these were fundamentally just stupid kids who had made a terrible decision while drunk. That didn't excuse their actions, but it did explain them. Ryan was helping Pete to his feet, both young men moving slowly and carefully. The confident group that had approached Tommy's post just minutes before was now a collection of bruised, frightened individuals who were beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. "What happens now?" Jake asked quietly, still sitting on the ground where Tommy had placed him. "Now," Tommy said, as the security guards finally reached their position, "you face the consequences of your choices. You wanted to see if you could make a Queen's Guard move. Congratulations, you succeeded. But you also learned that some people should never be underestimated, no matter how harmless they might appear." The lead security guard stepped forward, his radio crackling with communications from other units in the area. Behind him, the Metropolitan Police officers were spreading out to secure the scene and begin taking statements from witnesses. The incident that had started as drunken harassment was about to become a matter for the courts. The moment the palace security guards reached Tommy's position, he smoothly transitioned back into his ceremonial role. Without a word, he released Danny's hand and stepped back to his original post, assuming the perfectly rigid stance that had started this entire confrontation. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, transforming him from an active combatant back into a motionless, ceremonial figure. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that many of the tourists watching couldn't quite believe what they had just witnessed. 1 second, Tommy had been moving with the controlled precision of a combat veteran, systematically disabling 6 attackers. The next second, he was standing perfectly still again, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his breathing so controlled it was barely visible. Danny stood there for a moment, staring at his freed hand in shock, flexing his fingers as feeling returned to them. The young man who had started this confrontation with such confidence now looked completely lost, unsure of what to do next. The cocky grin that had been permanently fixed to his face was gone, replaced by an expression of genuine fear and confusion. "Sir, are you all right?" The lead security guard asked Tommy, though he already knew the answer. The guard's name was William, and he had been working palace security for over 15 years. He had seen Tommy handle difficult situations before, but never anything quite like this. Tommy's eyes flickered slightly toward William, the only acknowledgement he would give while on duty. It was a subtle communication that William understood. Perfectly, Tommy was fine, the situation was under control, and he was ready to resume his ceremonial duties as if nothing had happened. "Right then," William said, turning his attention to the 6 young men scattered around the pavement. "Let's sort this mess out." The Metropolitan Police officers were already spreading out, their experienced eyes taking in the scene and beginning to piece together what had happened. Sergeant Patricia Hayes, a 20-year veteran of the force, stepped forward to take charge of the situation. "I need everyone who isn't directly involved to step back and give us some room to work," she announced to the crowd of tourists. Her voice carried the kind of authority that people instinctively obeyed, and the spectators began to move away from the immediate area, but even as they stepped back, most of the tourists kept their phones out, still recording everything. The incident had been captured from multiple angles by dozens of different people, and Sergeant Hayes knew that videos of what had happened would be spreading across social media within minutes. Danny was the first of the 6 to be approached by the police. He stood there swaying slightly, the alcohol still affecting his balance, his hands still tingling from Tommy's iron grip. When Officer Martinez asked for his identification, Danny fumbled through his pockets with shaking hands. We didn't mean for it to go this far," Danny stammered, his earlier confidence completely gone. "We were just having a bit of fun. We didn't know he would. We thought he was just for show." Officer Martinez had seen plenty of drunk university students in his years on the force, but the fear in Danny's eyes was something different. This wasn't just someone worried about getting in trouble for public intoxication. This was someone who had finally realized the serious nature of what he had done. Pete was sitting on a nearby bench, still holding his midsection and breathing carefully. A paramedic had been called to check him over, though Tommy's strike had been precisely calculated to disable without causing lasting injury. The paramedic, a woman named Sarah, who had treated everything from heart attacks to knife wounds, was impressed by the accuracy of the blow. "Whoever hit you knew exactly what they were doing," she told Pete as she checked his pulse and breathing. "This is textbook non-lethal force. You'll be sore for a few days, but there's no permanent damage." Pete nodded weakly, too shaken to respond with words. The young man who had been eager to join Danny's assault on the guard was now facing the reality that he had attacked a trained soldier and was lucky to be walking away with just bruised ribs. Connor had been reunited with his glasses, but his hands were still shaking as he tried to answer the police officer's questions. The nervous young man who had always struggled to fit in with his wealthier friends was now facing the possibility of a criminal record that could destroy his future career prospects. "My dad's going to kill me," Connor whispered to himself, not caring who heard. "I'm supposed to start my job at the bank next month. They'll never hire someone with assault charges." Officer Rodriguez, who was taking Connor's statement, had heard similar worries hundreds of times before. Young people who made stupid decisions while drunk and then had to face the consequences when they sobered up. But assault on military personnel was more serious than the usual drunk and disorderly charges these kids were probably expecting. Ryan and Jake were standing together near the palace railings, both looking shell-shocked by how quickly their evening had gone wrong. They kept glancing over at Tommy, who had returned to his perfectly motionless stance as if the entire confrontation had never happened. "How is he just standing there like nothing happened?" Ryan asked quietly. 5 minutes ago he was throwing us around like we were children." Jake shook his head, still struggling to process what he had witnessed. "Did you see how fast he moved?" One second he was completely still, the next second we were all on the ground. I've never seen anything like it. Oliver, who had been hanging back during most of the confrontation, was now being questioned by Sergeant Hayes herself. As the most sober member of the group, he was able to give the clearest account of what had happened, though his version of events made it clear how badly they had misjudged the situation. "We thought it would be funny," Oliver admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Danny said we should see if we could make him move. We didn't think— we never imagined he could do what he did." Sergeant Hayes had been taking notes as Oliver spoke, but she paused to look over at Tommy, who remained in his perfect ceremonial stance. She had dealt with the Queen's Guard before and knew that these men were far more than ceremonial figures. They were elite soldiers chosen for their exceptional service records. "Did any of you bother to research what the Queen's Guard actually are before you decided to assault one?" She asked Oliver. Oliver shook his head miserably. "We just thought they were like ... actors or something. People dressed up to look impressive. For the tourist. They're active duty soldiers," Sergeant Hayes explained patiently. "Many of them are combat veterans who've served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other operational theaters. They're chosen for the Queen's Guard because of their exceptional military records, not because they look good in red uniforms." The reality of what they had done was continuing to sink in for all 6 young men. What they had thought was a harmless prank on a living statue had actually been an assault on a decorated combat veteran. The man they had tried to humiliate and overpower had more military training and experience than all of them combined. Back at his post, Tommy remained perfectly still, his breathing controlled, his eyes fixed straight ahead. To the casual observer, it would be impossible to tell that anything had happened at all. But the tourists who had witnessed the confrontation kept pointing him out to newcomers, whispering about what they had just seen. "That guard just took down 6 guys in about 10 seconds, one American tourist was explaining to his wife. It was like something out of an action movie, except it was real. Word of the incident was already spreading beyond the immediate crowd. Several of the tourists who had recorded the confrontation were uploading their videos to social media, where they would soon be viewed by millions of people around the world. The palace security team was now working with the police to clear the area and restore normal operations. William, the lead security guard, approached Tommy's position one more time. "Sergeant Richardson," he said quietly, using Tommy's military rank. "Outstanding work. Professional, controlled, and effective. Exactly what we'd expect from the Queen's Guard." Tommy's only response was the slightest nod, barely perceptible to anyone not watching closely. He remained at his post, ready to resume his ceremonial duties as soon as the area was cleared, as if defending himself against 6 attackers was just another part of his normal routine. The 6 university students, meanwhile, were beginning to understand that their night was far from over. They would be spending the next several hours in police custody, and their legal troubles were just beginning. 3 hours later, the area around Buckingham Palace had returned to its normal, bustling atmosphere, but the ripple effects of what had happened were just beginning to spread across the world. The videos captured by dozens of tourists were already going viral on social media platforms. With millions of views accumulating by the hour, the 6 university students found themselves in holding cells at the local police station, their evening of celebration having turned into the worst night of their lives. The alcohol had long since worn off, leaving them fully aware of the magnitude of their mistake. What had seemed like harmless fun just hours before was now looking like a decision that could permanently alter the course of their futures. Danny sat alone in his cell, staring at the concrete wall and replaying the events over and over in his mind. The confident young man who had led the assault on Tommy was gone, replaced by someone who was finally beginning to understand that actions have consequences. His expensive clothes were wrinkled and dirty from being thrown to the ground, and his hands still ached from Tommy's crushing grip. The reality of his situation was slowly sinking in. His father's law firm connections might help with legal representation, but they couldn't undo what he had done in front of dozens of witnesses and multiple camera phones. The videos of his assault on the Queen's Guard were already being shared across every social media platform, making him instantly recognizable to millions of people. In the cell next to him, Pete was lying on the narrow bench, still feeling the effects of Tommy's precise strike to his solar plexus. The paramedics had confirmed there was no permanent damage, but the pain served as a constant reminder of how completely outmatched they had been. Every breath reminded him that he had picked a fight with someone whose training and experience were far beyond anything he could have imagined. Connor was in a state of near panic, pacing back and forth in his small cell. The job offer from the prestigious bank that was supposed to start his career was now in serious jeopardy. Background checks for financial institutions were thorough, and assault charges against military personnel would be impossible to hide or explain away. The other three, Ryan, Jake, and Oliver, sat in their respective cells in shocked silence, each coming to terms with how dramatically their lives had changed in the span of just a few minutes. The university degrees they had been celebrating just hours before suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the criminal charges they were now facing. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, Tommy Richardson continued his ceremonial duties as if nothing had happened. He had been relieved from his post for a brief debriefing with his commanding officer, but had returned to duty within an hour. To anyone arriving at the palace for the first time that evening, there would be no indication that anything unusual had occurred, but word of the incident was spreading rapidly through military channels. Tommy's commanding officer, Colonel Andrews, had already reviewed the security footage and witness statements. What he saw was a textbook example of how a professional soldier should handle an assault: minimal force, maximum control, and immediate return to duties once the threat was neutralized. "Sergeant Richardson," Colonel Andrews had said during their brief meeting, "your conduct today was exemplary. You showed remarkable restraint under extremely difficult circumstances, and your response was proportionate and professional throughout." Tommy had simply nodded and requested permission to return to his post. He had done what any properly trained soldier would do when assaulted. He had defended himself and his equipment using the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat. In his mind, there was nothing heroic or exceptional about it, but the wider world saw things differently. The videos of the confrontation were being shared and reshared across social media platforms, with hashtags like #RoyalGuardJustice and #DONTMess, with the Guard trending worldwide. News outlets were picking up the story, and military experts were being interviewed to explain the training and background of the Queen's Guard. The public reaction was overwhelmingly supportive of Tommy's actions. Comments on the viral videos praised his professionalism and restraint, with many people pointing out that he could have inflicted much more serious injuries if he had chosen to. Military veterans were particularly vocal in their support, recognizing the skill and discipline required to neutralize 6 attackers without causing permanent harm. By the next morning, the story had made international headlines. News programs around the world were showing the footage of 6 university students assaulting a Queen's Guard and the swift, professional response that followed. Military recruitment offices reported increased interest from young people inspired by Tommy's example of disciplined service. The university that the 6 students attended was facing its own crisis. The dean had called an emergency meeting to discuss the incident, and there was serious discussion about disciplinary action that could include expulsion. The institution's reputation was being damaged by association with the attack, and they needed to respond decisively to maintain their standing. Danny's father, despite his legal connections, was struggling to find lawyers willing to take the case. The evidence was overwhelming, dozens of witnesses and multiple video angles showing his son clearly initiating and leading the assault. More concerning was the potential for terrorism-related charges, which carried much more serious penalties than simple assault. The Crown Prosecution Service was taking the case very seriously. In the current security environment, any assault on military personnel or attempts to take their weapons were being prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The fact that it had occurred at one of Britain's most important symbolic locations only made the charges more severe. Pete's parents had driven down from Manchester after receiving the phone call no parent wants to get His mother had cried when she saw the footage online, not from sympathy for her son's situation, but from shame at his behavior. His father, a former soldier himself, was particularly disgusted by the assault on a fellow serviceman. Connor's job offer was officially withdrawn 3 days later, when the bank's Human Resources Department completed their review of the incident. The background check that was part of his employment process had flagged the pending criminal charges, and the institution decided they couldn't risk associating with someone involved in such a high-profile case. The legal proceedings moved forward quickly. All 6 young men eventually pleaded guilty to assault charges, hoping to avoid the more serious terrorism-related counts that prosecutors were considering. Danny, as the ringleader, received the harshest sentence, 6 months in prison and a substantial fine. The others received suspended sentences and community service, but all of them now had criminal records that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Tommy, meanwhile, was recommended for a commendation by his superiors. The incident had become a powerful example of the professionalism and capability of the Queen's Guard, dispelling any notion that they were merely ceremonial figures. Military academies began using footage of the incident in their training programs, showing how proper discipline and training should be applied in difficult situations. The viral videos of the confrontation became a lasting reminder that some people should never be underestimated based on appearances. Tommy Richardson had shown the world that beneath the ceremonial red uniform and towering bearskin hat stood not just a symbol of British tradition, but a highly trained soldier capable of defending himself and his post against any threat. Years later, tour guides would still point out the spot where the incident occurred, telling visitors about the day when 6 university students learned the hard way that the Queen's Guards are far more than decorative figures. And Tommy Richardson would continue his service, having proven that the combination of military excellence and ceremonial dignity could coexist in the same person. The incident served as a powerful reminder that respect must be earned through actions, not demanded through position, and that true strength often comes in the form of restraint and professionalism rather than aggression and violence.